Hi everyone, this is going to be a quick video overview of the axial skeleton for those of you who maybe need a little bit of extra exposure to this material or who are maybe not able to come to lab. So I'm going to do the axial skeleton first, starting with the skull, and then we're going to work our way through the appendicular skeleton in a separate video. So this is going to be kind of a quick overview, just in the interest of keeping the video short, but of course you are able to pause and use that to take notes basically at your leisure. So I'm actually going to start the skull with the cranium or calvarium, which is the dome-shaped set of bones that covers the skull, and we're just going to go through them one by one. So first one here on the front, that is your forehead. That is going to be the frontal bone. And the frontal bone is just one big kind of dome-shaped, fused, smooth bone. And behind the frontal bone, we see a line, okay, and this kind of jagged line that wraps all the way around. That type of joint is called a suture, and the sutures are the joints that connect the bones of the skull to each other. This particular suture is named after one of the planes that we talked about. That would be the coronal plane. Okay, coronal plane divides the body into front and back, anterior and posterior, and the coronal suture separates your frontal bone from the rest of the skull. Okay, now behind the frontal bone, on the sides of the head, you have the two parietal bones. Okay, great big parietal bones. They are separated from each other by another suture, this one also named after a plane of the body. In this case, that is the sagittal suture. Okay, remember, a sagittal plane is going to separate the body into left and right pieces. So, frontal bone with the coronal suture here, two parietal bones with the sagittal suture separating them, and then we get to the back of the skull, and we're going to ignore this line right here and focus on this one. This is called the lambdoidal suture. Okay, lambdoidal suture is named after the Greek letter lambda, which looks like an upside down Y, and so you can kind of see how this suture gets that name. But the lambdoidal suture here is going to separate your two parietal bones from your occipital bone, which is the base of the skull. And we'll kind of flip this over and look at a few more pieces of it here in just a second. Okay, but we also have to go over to the other bones of the cranium, namely the temporal bone right here. Temporal bone makes up the majority of the kind of lower side of your skull, and it's got a lot of stuff that we need to know. So first we'll go with the suture. It is separated from your parietal bones by the squamosal suture, which essentially, if you kind of take your finger and draw a line over the top of your ear, just around your ear, that's roughly where that suture is. Okay, so temporal bone right here. Temporal bone has a number of different features that we need to know. I'm going to try and zoom in on them here to see them a little more clearly. The first one that you will notice is the hole right there. That is called the external acoustic or external auditory meatus, and that's basically your ear hole. Okay, so if you were looking in a real skull and looked in there, you would see the tympanum, which is the eardrum membrane. And then you would see the malleus, incus, and stapes, the little bitty inner ear bones that you guys will learn about in A&P 2. Okay, also present on here, we have a great big bump. Okay, that great big bump, if you feel up behind your ear, you can feel that. Okay, big, thick external process. That is called the mastoid process. And the mastoid process is actually a point of attachment or insertion for a big muscle that runs up the side of your neck called the sternocleidomastoid, which we will be talking about when we get into our muscle unit. Okay, so mastoid process right here. To the inside of that, you're going to see a sharp, skinny, fang-like projection coming down from your temporal bone. Again, this is to the inside and slightly in front of the mastoid process. You can kind of see it right there. Okay, that is called the styloid process. The styloid process refers to the basically a stylus, which is just like a sharp writing instrument, and that's kind of what these are shaped like. And so you'll see numerous styloid processes throughout the body. It just means it's something skinny and pointy. Okay, that is also a point for muscle attachment. That would be the point of attachment for the stylohyoid muscle, which suspends your hyoid bone, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Okay, so now I am going to pop the top off of this thing so that I can flip it over and we can see it a little bit more clearly. We are going to look inside it here in just a second, but first we want to flip it over and look at it from the underside, okay? So over here we have our two temporal bones, okay? Mastoid processes right here. In front of those, we can see the temporomandibular fossa, which is where your mandible would insert, and your mandible is your lower jaw. So it would sit in there just like that, and we'll kind of see that again here in just a moment from the other side. Okay, but what I want to look at right now is the occipital bone. Okay, the occipital bone is the base of your skull where it sits on top of your spinal column. You will very quickly notice something obvious about this, and that is the big hole in the center. Okay, that big hole is where your spinal cord exits the brain and runs through the vertebral canal. Okay, this one is very creatively named the foramen magnum, which is Latin for big hole. Okay, so foramen magnum is a feature you will need to know. Now on either side of the foramen magnum here, you have two condyles. And I mentioned this in class, but these condyles are kind of shaped like the feet of a rocking chair, okay, with a curvature like that. And that's what allows your skull to pivot up and down on top of your first cervical vertebra, the atlas, okay? So, occipital bone, foramen magnum, occipital condyles. There's a lot of other tiny little holes in here that you guys do not have to worry about, fortunately, because there's a lot of them and their location is kind of variable, okay? Only other thing you might notice on this is this bump on the back. That's called the external occipital protuberance, and that is something you can feel on your skull. It is not something you'll have to know for the test, though. Okay, so now let's flip this thing over and look at it from the inside. Okay, there is an area on your lab manual that it kind of wants you to label, okay? And that is this kind of indentation here at the back of the occipital bone. That area is called the posterior cranial fossa, and that is where the cerebellum sits. Okay, the cerebellum is one of the three major parts of your brain, and it hangs off the cerebrum and kind of keeps you alive and stuff like that while you try to do math problems and think about what you're going to have for lunch. Kind of runs things in the background. Okay, we also notice our big foramen magnum there, but what we're going to focus on here is this bone in the middle. Okay, this is the sphenoid bone, and the sphenoid bone has a really unique shape. Okay, when you look at it on its own, it looks kind of like a bird or a bat or something like that. It looks like it has wings, and so the two major pieces of the sphenoid bone are called wings. Okay, the lower portions, and notice that there's a sharp rise up here. Okay, basically you're looking here at the back of your eye socket. So the lower portion of the sphenoid goes up to there. That is going to be the greater wing. The greater wing is also visible from the outside, directly behind the eye and in front of the temporal bone right here. So greater wing is the major portion of the sphenoid bone. Okay, in the middle, okay, we have the body of the sphenoid bone, and in the middle of that we have an indentation, which you can kind of see from the side there. That is called the sella turcica. Okay, sella turcica means Turkish saddle. Okay, somebody thought this looked like the saddles that they saw in Turkey. But anyway, that's where your pituitary gland sits, which is a really important endocrine gland that hangs off the bottom of your brain. Okay, above the lower portion, which is the greater wing of the sphenoid, you have the lesser wing. Okay, and the lesser wing goes across the top here as a very sharp ridge that is elevated. Okay, you will have to know the sphenoid and the ethmoid on their own, but we'll kind of look at those here in a few minutes, okay? Just separated from everything. Okay, the only other thing you really need to know on the inside of the skull is going to be this guy right here. Okay, that is part of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone basically sits right between your eyes, kind of at the top of your nasal cavity. And this portion right here, you've got a sharp ridge in the middle with two indentations on either side. Okay, those indentations are called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And if you were looking at this in a real skull and not one that's made of plastic, you would see that it's full of teeny tiny little holes called olfactory foramina. Okay, and then in the middle of this, the sharp ridge that we get in there, that is called the crista galli. Okay, Crista galli refers to like the coxcomb or the crest on the rooster's head, which again, somebody thought that's what that looked like. Okay, the Crista galli serves to separate the two bulbs of your olfactory nerves, that is cranial nerve number 1. Okay, those nerves sit on either side of the Crista galli, embedded into the cribriform plate, with nerve endings extending down into the nasal cavity. Okay, and that's what gives you your sense of smell. Basically, they come down into this area here. Okay, so that is the major bones of the cranium. Right, now we're going to look at the face. Okay, facial bones. Right, so we adjust our lighting here. There we go. Okay, major bone of the lower face. Okay, your entire upper jaw and going up the sides of your nose. That bone is called the maxilla. Okay, maxilla. The maxilla down here around the teeth has a bumpy area around the gum line called an alveolar margin, and that's basically where the teeth sockets are. The maxilla, if we look under here, also makes up a major portion of the hard palate. Okay, this area is called the palatine process of the maxilla. Right behind it, we see another bone. That is the palatine bone. So we have palatine process of the maxilla, which is everything between the teeth. And then at the very back of the hard palate, we have the palatine bone proper. Okay? We also look up in here, we're looking into the nasal cavity. Okay? This is the opening from the nasopharynx, where it joins up with the oropharynx, which is the opening at the back of your mouth, to form a common opening, which is why you can like breathe and also eat with your mouth. Okay? They open up into the same space. Okay, in here, forming the bottom of this and kind of bracing the upper mouth, as well as making the bottom portion of your nasal septum, you have a bone called the vomer. Okay, so the vomer basically curves upwards as it goes back into the nasal cavity. And then you can kind of see this on here. I'm trying to angle it so we can see it properly. There's a curvature to this. Where it starts to curve back forward again, you're no longer dealing with the vomer, making up the bottom of the nasal septum. Now you are dealing with part of the ethmoid called the perpendicular plate. Okay? So anyway, maxilla extends all the way up to the side of the nose, and then on the bridge of the nose we have the two nasal bones. Okay, nasal bone. Sometimes there's two, sometimes there's more, but they all kind of do the same thing. It's just the bridge of your nose. Okay, looking into here, we also see 2 of our 3 sets of turbinates or nasal concha, and those are the curved pieces of bone that are projecting inwards from the outside of the nasal cavity. Okay, down here at the bottom, you have the inferior nasal concha. Up here, we have the middle nasal concha, and then way up buried in the ethmoid where you can't see them, you would have the superior nasal concha. You don't have to know that one because you can't see it, just inferior and middle. Okay, so now let's look at our cheeks. Okay, over here we have the zygomatic bone. Zygomatic bone is your major cheekbone over here, and it actually connects with the temporal bone to form the zygomatic arch. And I talked a little bit in lab about the evolutionary implications of the zygomatic arch, but that's not something you really need to know. Basically what it does is stack your jaw muscles on top of each other to give you much more efficient bite pressure relative to the muscle mass necessary. It provides a kind of a mechanical advantage there. So the issue with this arch is that it's made up of processes from 2 different bones. Okay, one from your temporal bone, the other from the zygomatic bone. And those processes are named after the bones that they go to. So coming from the temporal bone, we have the zygomatic process. Coming from the zygomatic bone, we have the temporal process right here. Okay, so that is going to be a tricky part on this test, is identifying those specifically by name. If you want to give the correct answer and get full credit, you would have to say, if it says like name this process, be specific, or name this process including the name of the bone, you would have to say this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because that's the bone it's coming from. Okay, so a little bit complex there. Now if we look into our orbit, okay, the eye socket here, The zygomatic bone makes up part of the outside of the orbit. The frontal bone makes up the top of the orbit. The maxilla makes up part of the orbital floor. Your sphenoid, okay, remember your sphenoid is this big bone in the middle that kind of forms the bridge between your face and the rest of your skull. The sphenoid makes up the back, the posterior wall of the orbit. And then if you look at the medial wall, okay, we see two different bones in here. The big one, okay, right between the eyes there is the ethmoid. Okay, remember the ethmoid makes up the perpendicular plate up here, which is the upper part of your nasal septum, and it also corresponds to this area in the skull where the olfactory foramina are in the cribriform plate. So major structural bone that's just not really visible from the outside. Okay, but it is hollow, so when you breathe in, these nasal concha actually cause a vortex pattern in the air, which spins particulates out and makes them interact with the olfactory epithelium. That's what gives you your sense of smell. Okay, you will also see in front of the ethmoid bone, you're going to see the lacrimal bone. Okay, the lacrimal bone is a teeny tiny little bone that has a big hole in it. That hole is called the lacrimal fossa. Okay, lacrimal fossa is the tear duct. So your tears are actually produced by a gland up here. They run across and down the eye and go into that duct, and then they drain into your nasal cavities, which is why if your eyes are really itchy or irritated from, whether you're crying or, allergies or something like that, that's why your nose also starts running, because tears run down into that cavity. Okay? I think if there's other stuff on here that I'm leaving out, but I do not believe there is. Okay, so let's just really quickly review them again. You have your maxilla, which is the upper jaw, runs all the way up the side of the nose. You have the nasal bones right here, zygomatic bones out here for the cheeks, and then inside the orbit at the back you have the sphenoid, in the middle you have the ethmoid, and then we have the lacrimal bone with the lacrimal fossa. Okay, in here we have the vomer making up the bottom of the nasal septum. We have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid making up the upper part of the nasal septum. And then we have our inferior and middle nasal concha, which are the curls of bone projecting in there. Okay, again, if we flip it over and look at the bottom here, between the teeth you have the palatine process of the maxilla, and that also includes the alveolar margin, the bumpy gum line there. And then at the back of that, you have the palatine bone itself, okay, where there are not any teeth. Okay, so now we are going to really quickly look at the lower jaw or mandible. Okay, so here is your mandible. Try to do this on camera. I got lucky. All right, so your mandible. Okay, your mandible fits into an indentation, a little notch in the temporal bone called the mandibular fossa or temporomandibular fossa. That is also known as the temporomandibular joint or TMJ. Okay, that is a highly mobile joint. Its main motion, of course, is the hinge motion that you use to chew your food, but it is also capable of protraction, retraction, as well as some side-to-side motion as well. Okay, so pretty mobile. So let's just focus on this thing. Okay, this is your mandible. Your mandible consists of three main pieces. Okay, you have the body of the mandible, which if we look at it from below is a big, thick, kind of horseshoe-shaped bone, and that's where your teeth are. Okay, once again, you have an alveolar margin. Okay, that's the gum line. And here we also see a little hole that is called the mental foramen. Okay, mental means chin in Latin. That foramen is the hole in the chin, and that is where the mental nerve comes out, which is a nerve that has to be deadened if you're going to have oral surgery in the lower jaw. Okay, we also see another foramen, which I'm not 100% sure if it's on your word list, but we can talk about it. Right up here in between your two front teeth, just behind them, that is called the incisive foramen, named after the incisors, which is this group of teeth up here. That's why, like, if you bite down on something and it stabs the roof of your mouth, it hurts so much. Okay, that's a sensory nerve, and if you poke it, it's going to let you know that you have messed up. Okay, so anyway, body of the mandible, alveolar margin, mental foramen. As your mandible curves backwards, it's going to take a sharp upward turn. This point here is called the angle of the mandible. And as it goes upwards, it flattens out. And we can kind of see that in the profile here. Big, thick body for chewing on stuff. Wide, thin, flat area right here is called the ramus of the mandible. So body, angle, ramus. And the ramus has two processes. At the back, you've got your mandibular condyles, which interface with the temporal bone to make the TMJ. And in front, you have the coronoid process, which is kind of shaped like the tip of a butter knife. It's very sharp, okay? Very sharp blade-like there. And I'm going to try to show this on the camera. I'm not 100% sure that it's going to show up well. But if you look down through the zygomatic arch there, you can actually see the coronoid process. Okay, so in terms of like mammalian evolution, cheeks are a big feature that other animals don't really have. And basically what happened is this zygomatic arch moved our jaw muscles from the back of our skulls forward over the teeth, which gives us a mechanical advantage, and it also stacks them on top of each other. So we're going to talk about the different muscles when we get into the muscle unit, but there's one muscle called the masseter, which runs from the zygomatic arch down to the ramus of the mandible. There's another muscle called the temporalis that fans out across the temporal bone on the surface of the skull and runs through this hole and inserts right there. So that gives us a tremendous mechanical advantage in terms of chewing our food, which other animals don't really do, like crocodiles and fish and things like that. They don't really chew their food. They don't really have the ability to do so. Right? So that is the skull. The next video is going to cover the rest of the axial skeleton. I'm going to go ahead and stop this one just to keep the file size a little bit smaller. So stay tuned for the next one.